One thing I'm particularly proud of that I've been working on, been thinking about for a couple of years, and finally sat down for a couple of weeks and just put my nose to the grindstone. If you look, you'll find in there, there's kind of a page that kind of sticks out. It's a chart. This is really cool if you are, this is 7 of the books that I play out of the most, obviously quite a bit of Delacluse and some of the standard books. But what I've done is I've gone through, there's probably 25 to 30 different major orchestral and band pieces in there. And what I've done is I've gone through these 7 books and kind of identified pieces, etudes that are stylistically similar, that sort of test the same set of skills. And one thing I want to say, I'd say the most blanket statement about maximizing your method books is, I've been doing this a long time, I have 15 or 20 books, probably more than that. And that, for me, more is just to have different material to read. But seriously, one of the easiest ways, you don't necessarily have to buy that many books to get great material to sight read and to play out of. One of the simplest ways to change and update an etude is just change the tempo, or change the dynamic. Believe me, you double the tempo or take the tempo in half, it completely changes the character and it changes what an etude is testing. Another way that's really good to do that, to really find out what your hands are made of, is to consider playing even something like a rudimental solo or Delacluse like entirely at pianissimo. I mean, if you really want to find out what you're made of, do something like that. And one of the big reasons to do things like that is if you can play Delacluse, an entire etude pianissimo, like the whole thing, then when you go into your lesson, you prepared that week, and he may not want to hear it that way, you just get to play for it. It's like, oh, I feel so good. So a lot of what I do when I'm practicing is I try to make my life as difficult as possible within reason in the practice room, so that the real world, when I'm under the gun and I feel nervous and weird stuff happens, I'm actually already a little more comfortable than I am in the practice room. Does that make sense? Yeah. And there's a lot of ways to do that, but like, there's a lot of exploration of your etude books that can happen. Who among you has ever played out of Keith Aleo's book? I'm just curious. This is one I was just recently introduced to, and that's actually worth checking out. He's got some really nice stuff in there. It's kind of, difficulty-wise, I'd say it's kind of like in between Delacluse and Sarome. And it's got some nice groovy stuff that is often very repetitive and feels a little more orchestrally oriented. So one thing you may notice on that sheet, if you first kind of look at, there's sort of some jumbled areas where a lot of etudes out of a lot of books exist that to me have a lot of practical uses. And then if you look down the chart, I think it's the 5th one over, which is the original Delacluse book, you notice there's not really a whole lot of numbers down that column. And it's kind of funny if you really think about the style of those etudes, like they very much sound like popcorn going off in the microwave, I always thought. It's not to say they're not great, because they are, but they don't have that repetitive nature that most typical snare drum parts have. So if you're gearing up to play a snare drum part in the ensemble, you're probably going to be playing a lot of stuff like that. That's not very Delacluse-y, right? You know, at least not in that book. I will say that his Kaiserslaviana books, which came a little later, most of those etudes are based on snare drum parts or actual parts from the ensemble. So, for example, let me point this one out. I think it's example 4. If you guys flip past that chart, I have some specific examples, and there's one from each of the 7 etude books that are in there. But if you look at example 4, this was something I honestly only discovered as I really started getting intense with this project. He's very clever about quoting different things, and it's not always a snare drum part. So you can see, if you guys ever worked on the xylophone part from Leno's before? So check out, like, look at the rhythm from the Delacluse etude, and then look at the rhythm from the xylophone part. It is not hidden. I mean, it's very blatantly quoted, but yeah. And there's quite a few like that in Delacluse. If you start thinking not so much rhythmically as melodically, you can start hearing melodies when you play. There's a famous one, I think it's number 6 from one of the Kaiserslaviana. That's the Berlioz Hungarian March. And it's not a melody, of course, because you're playing on snare drum, but you're playing the exact same rhythm, which isn't anything really like the snare drum part at all. But he's just stealing from the violins. So Delacluse tells you very cryptically in his books, it's like, you know, these are all based on snare drum parts, and some of them you're like, what? Like sometimes you're really searching for what it is. And sometimes it's very obvious. Like there's a Daphnis and Chloe thing that's very clear. There's an Einheldenleben one that's very obvious. And he sort of quotes it directly. guys like Cerrone in his book, in the 50, you know, the Portraits in Rhythm, he'll actually say, this is based on Scheherazade third movement, and he tells you. I think Gar Whaley or Vic Firth have a similar type of thing. They don't tell you that it's Scheherazade third movement, but you know it when you're playing it. And those things are great because they'll basically give you the same licks, and they just kind of advance them a little bit. So again, what you're playing in the etude is a little more advanced than what you actually have to do on the job or in the rehearsal. So it's worth taking some time. Anyway, explore that, have some fun with that, and the real lesson there, you don't have to have all those books to experience this in the practice room. Look through your own books. You're going to find a lot of things. Some of them are very clearly referenced. Some of them, there may just be a phrase or two that you're using the same kind of techniques. Some of them you may have to adjust, make an adjustment to the dynamics or make an adjustment to the tempo. But again, there's a lot of ways to make really good use of the books you already have.